everyone. Thanks for coming. This talk is called Emerging Models for Open Source Contributions. Just as a little background on me, leading off of that, I've been doing a bunch of research around open source sustainability, how projects are created, how do they grow, how do they survive or not survive. And I found some pretty interesting stuff around the evolution of how we think about open source contributions, and sort of these different models that have emerged over time based on how open source itself is changing. So I thought it'd be cool to go through a brief history of different models of managing open source contributions and governance models. Some of them you're probably familiar with, and going through sort of the BDFL and how that led into the meritocracy, and then sort of what we're seeing today around how contributions are changing and the nature of contributions, and what we might expect to see for the future. And so again, all these different models are solving for different market needs. And what I mean by the market is people that are using open source software and people that are contributing to open source software. And so as the amount of users and contributors has changed and the makeup of those populations has changed, we've seen sort of changes in the models themselves of how we manage those contributions. So starting in the beginning of open source software, in the 80s and late 1990s, you had the BDFL, which was sort of this prevalent model for managing open source contributions. BDFL is benevolent dictator for life, and it's most closely associated with Linux, even though it actually came from Python. And so under the BDFL model, you have people that anyone is able to make contributions, anyone's able to have their say. But in the end, you have this one person, the benevolent dictator, who has final say on everything. And this made a lot of sense early on in open source, because you didn't have as many people using open source, and you didn't have as many people contributing back to it. So in the 80s, proprietary software was still the default. Open source was sort of this counterculture or alternative. So you didn't have as much demand on the software. And then on the contributor side, in the 80s, it's a lot harder to learn how to code, right? Learning how to code is not that accessible. Being a software developer is sort of this serious profession that you have to devote yourself to. So you don't have as many people that are even able to contribute to open source software. So without having demand on the user side and demand on the contributor side, you can imagine why it's fairly easy for one person to say, hey, I made this project, I open sourced it, so I'm in charge. And everyone's like, cool, okay. And so the BDFL model still has benefits. Most importantly, there's this centralized leadership and governance. So everybody knows who's in charge. Everybody knows the one person they're supposed to go to if they want to see anything changed. And then along with that, you also have a more centralized roadmap and product direction. Because again, you don't have a lot of people that are trying to argue about what the direction of the product should be. You have one person who has final say. But in the end, because it is a benevolent dictator, sort of by definition, it's a lot less democratic. So if you are part of this community and you want to have your say in a project, the best you can really do is get to know the BDFL and kind of hope that you can influence this person to take your opinion into account, which is not really that useful. And this setup, this BDFL setup, made companies nervous. So again, open source is not the default in the 80s. Companies were nervous about contributing to open source. They were nervous about using open source projects. And part of it was because they look at these BDFLs and they're like, okay, so this one person that I have no formal relationship with and I have no formal pathway to be able to influence can make arbitrary decisions that affect my product that I'm trying to sell to other people. That doesn't really make sense. And sort of on this high level, open source needed company buy-in to be able to succeed. So if companies weren't willing to use open source software, then open source would end up becoming this hobby thing instead of becoming the default that it is today. So that ended up taking us into the meritocracy. The meritocracy was largely driven by the Apache Software Foundation, which was established in 1999. And what they did was basically flatten the BDFL model to let multiple actors participate. So now instead of having one person with final say, You have like multiple people that are weighing in. And so anyone with merit can contribute to this project or make substantial contributions. Anyone with merit can have a binding vote on decisions in a project. So this is really great for company buy-in, because now companies aren't worried about, well, what happens if this project gets really popular and my competitor is controlling it? They have a path to be able to participate, to have a say in the project. Apache also did a lot around legal protections for people that were contributing to the project. So they took care of a lot of these things. It became this sort of like neutral, safe space. And that is because we had the meritocracy. That's a big reason why open source is so popular today. Part of it is because companies weren't comfortable using it before, and when they had this like BDFL, and then now that they have meritocracy, they feel like they can participate, and now they feel comfortable using it. So we actually have the meritocracy to thank for open source being more of a standard today. But there's still the problem, right, in the form of this like one clause that I used earlier, which is with merit. And it's like, well, what does it mean to have merit? How does one get merit? I pulled this from Apache Software Foundation. Basically, it's saying that people have to earn the right to have merit. Merit is a privilege that needs to be earned. And when they talk about how they think about people with merit, they say that they're filtering for people that they think are committed enough to the task, so they've proven that they actually care about the project, and that match the human attitudes required to work well with others. So basically saying, you're not going to rock the boat. So they have this sort of like criteria around like what they think someone with merit actually means. So basically, like if you want to be part of a meritocracy, you need to prove yourself. And you prove yourself by spending time on a project, right? So the more time you spend, the more devoted you are, the more committed you are, the more you're able to prove that you have this merit, and then therefore you have more of a say in the project. So this makes sense in theory, right? For any sort of like membership organization, even outside of open source, if you thought about starting a club or something, it's like, well, of course it makes sense that only members or people who have earned somehow the right to say something get a voice. But in practice, this ends up favoring people who can pay to play. And it's not just paying with money in this case, but it's also paying with time. So you can imagine in theory a company that can devote full-time employee resources to a project or somehow create full-time contributors to open source. Those people are going to be listened to and heard a lot more than a part-time contributor, even if that part-time contributor is really passionate about the project. So this ends up becoming a problem. And it might have just sort of stayed that way if we hadn't seen a shift in how people were contributing to open source today. And so today you have this emerging model of liberal contribution. As far as I can tell, that term was coined by Node.js, and they really helped pioneer this model. So I'm going to use them as an example. So what's happening today, compared to if you think back to like what was happening in the 80s, you have more people using open source, and you have more tech talent than ever before. So on the user front, there isn't a whole lot of data on this, but I saw one survey that said that the number of companies that said they use open source in their software has doubled in the past 5 years. And that sort of matches our intuition, right? Like there are lots and lots of people that are using open source software. And then on the other side, you have more people that are able to code, learning how to code, want to contribute somehow than ever before. You have this explosion of coding classes and boot camps. All this has happened in the past 5 years. So now you have lots of people who want to contribute in theory, and then you have a lot of people who are using the software. So there's just like tons of demand going on from all sides. And if you're interested in sort of like why this happened, basically blame it on GitHub. GitHub made it easier for anyone to jump in on a project than before, and partially enabled by Git. So before, if you wanted to contribute to an open source project, each one has its own website. It might have its own issue trackers or tools, its own version control, separate mailing list, everything. So to jump into each one of these projects was actually a lot of mindshare. And today, obviously there are plenty of projects that are not on GitHub, but for the ones that are on GitHub, and as open source is centralizing, you can use the same issue tracker, same version control, same UI to contribute to different projects on the same platform. So now you have a lot of people that are dipping in and out of projects and don't have as much commitment to each one. And sort of just supporting this, last year someone did a survey and found that of the top GitHub projects across languages, about half of the contributors to those projects only made one contribution. So you have this really long tail of like very casual contributors. So yeah, this is all leading to more noise. And if you think about up to this point, we only have the BDFL and the meritocracy. Under a meritocracy, all this noise is a bad thing. Because the whole point of a meritocracy is that you have to earn your right to have a say in this project. And casual contributors haven't earned their voice. And so they're really frustrated by this noise. BDFL model also would be frustrated by this noise. And their reaction is basically like, make these people go away, filter out the noise, we don't want them here. So some people looked at them and they saw an opportunity. So instead of tuning out the noise, projects like Node ended up harnessing and redirecting all this excited talent, all these people that wanted to be doing things. So they did a couple of things. In 2014, Node dropped their CLA requirement. CLA is Contributor License Agreement. It's basically some legal hoops that you need to jump through before you contribute to a project. And Node at the time was stewarded by Joyent. And so Brian Cantrell saw this as a corporate anti-pattern. So he's basically saying that like every company is requiring a CLA, and they do it because they think that's what they're supposed to do. But what happens if you drop it? Would we see a difference in behavior that we might not have expected to see? And so he's saying, even though there are plenty of reasons to have a CLA, and he knows that those reasons exist, even at their very best, CLAs seem like asking people to go to the dentist before their pull request can be considered. They also adopted a more liberal contribution policy. And so there were like a lot of different components to this, and they happened over the years. So I'm not going to really go into all the things that they did. But I think this quote from Michael Rogers sums it up pretty well, which was, getting people to contribute is hard. Everybody who runs a project knows that. When you distribute ownership, people contribute more. And if anyone does something wrong, Git is good at removing things. Right? So again, there's this marriage between the tools that enable people to work together more collaboratively, and that being able to enable this more liberal type of governance and more liberal approach to contributions. Because if anything bad happens, we have the tools to reverse it. So they did all that, and then some fun things started to happen. So they did see way more contributions than they ever had before. They started adopting some of these policies at a time when their contribution level was at its lowest. And there was a fork that I won't really go into here, but part of the reason for the fork, among other things, was to be able to experiment with some of these contribution policies. And clearly it started to work. They also got a lot of free marketing. This is something I don't really see Node talk about, but it was just something I noticed. So when you engage all these casual contributors and you tell them, like, you are part of this project, you should feel ownership over this project, they get really excited. And they start becoming these like natural word-of-mouth ambassadors. And so one successful project that came out of that, I think really embodies it, is Node School. And Node School was a totally community-run project, bunch of tutorials around like how to use Node. It just kind of spread like wildfire. People were doing Node schools in their own cities. They were doing different translations, all these meetups. It was really, really successful. And I think part of that was just because contributors were like so excited that they were considered to be a part of this thing that they wanted to help share it with other people. And finally, taking a more liberal approach to contributions ended up attracting all these different perspectives, different types of contributions, and people from different backgrounds. And again, returning to Michael, he basically said that people need to be enabled to do good work. Sometimes they're just asking for permission. And when you make it really obvious what they can do, more people will do, and they won't be people just like you. So all this was really great. And it started kicking off a lot of conversation around like how do we make contributions as easy and permissionless as possible. And so it's still a new model, but I wanted to go through, mention another example of a project that's adopting the liberal contribution model, which is Rust. And Rust is interesting because they actually started under the BDFL model. So it was started by one employee at Mozilla. And sponsored by Mozilla, worked on it for a couple of years. When he stepped down, he named another BDFL in 2013, and that person decided to open up governance to a core team. And then last year, they went from the core team to like more of these little sub-teams. So they basically started with like one person, and then like a small group of people, and now they have like an official governance structure that is even wider. And so REST today has over 1,200 contributors, which is a lot. And a lot of them make regular contributions. So I want you to like remember this graph, because I'll show you an example of a BDFL one later. But you can see that there's sort of like this fat tail of contributions, where not only are a lot of people contributing, but they're also making like pretty significant number of commits. And just sort of like going through their philosophy a little bit, this quote comes from Alex Crichton, who's one of the maintainers, when he was describing the decision to go from a core team to like all these extra sub-teams. He was basically saying, to the extent practical, we should include a diverse range of perspectives, and especially include people like our users. And so again, this is like a totally different shift from what happened under a meritocracy, where it was like, you can have a say when you've kind of proven that you care. And here, Russ is suggesting that like we default to assuming that anyone who's being touched by this project or being affected, we should really care about their perspective. So just some patterns that I've seen around liberal contribution models, if you're interested in how they work. I think functionally, like a lot of these still have similar governance in the sense of there is some sort of core team, there's someone in charge. It's not like it's total anarchy, but the difference is sort of their approach and philosophy to how they think about contributions. So firstly, the idea of floodgates rather than bottlenecks. So the sort of this defining feature around BDFLs and meritocracies and how we've thought about contributions up until recently was you have like tons of noise, tons of demand on you, and like create this narrow bottleneck, create all these hoops that people have to jump through, and so you end up only filtering through the people who really care. And again, like totally logical. But it's sort of counterintuitive, but under a liberal contribution model, you think about opening everything up into these floodgates. The idea being that, let's say, in a bottleneck, you have like one maintainer who's trying to teach like 10 other people how to do something, right? The 10 who have proven themselves. But under a floodgate, you might have like 100 people coming in who are all really excited and engaged, and hopefully those 100 people start teaching each other. And then the original maintainer can kind of like take a step back and not be as involved. So it ends up being a lot less work for the maintainer, ultimately, even though it's sort of counterintuitive. Another feature is consensus seeking rather than consensus. So under a meritocracy, for example, you have people that are taking these binding votes. And the idea is whenever there's a decision that needs to be made, everybody votes. Under a liberal contribution model, they emphasize the discussion and the process rather than a final vote. So someone might say, here's an issue I'm raising. Let's talk about it. Let's work out all the major issues. And at some point, when there are no more major issues, people might say, okay, like, are we good here? And there's still usually some sort of core team or technical committee that, that like, can be the tiebreaker for a vote. But the idea is to emphasize discussion as much as possible and avoid having to come to this like pure vote. Thirdly, meeting contributors where they are. This is a big reason why people are talking so much about the value of good documentation, writing good contributing guides, tagging bugs as like good first bugs or beginner bugs. All these practices are practices of meeting contributors where they are. So again, instead of a maintainer saying, like, this is my project, and you need to prove yourself to me, you need to prove that you care, and here are the things that I need. It's saying, hey, what do you want to be doing? And how can I make it as easy as possible for you to get that done? And finally, just defaulting to yes. So starting with the idea that all contributions should be accepted by default. And if they're not being accepted, then the onus is on the maintainer to say why it's not good for the project. Even if functionally this doesn't look different, the idea is that instead of saying, again, like, you need to prove to me why I should accept your contribution, it's saying, yeah, I want to accept your contribution. Here are the objections I might have. So putting it all together, I just wanted to go through a couple of clarifying questions around these models. So first question is sort of do BDFLs still matter? I hear some people saying, oh, the BDFL model is totally dying out. The whole Linux Python type model is dying out, and we have this whole new wave in the future. I actually think BDFLs still really matter. Early on in a project, centralization is still really important, right? Pretty much every project I've looked at started with literally one person that worked really, really hard on the project up front. And then maybe the model changed over time, but they almost all start with one person. So a BDFL early on can help incubate the project. It can help set a product vision. In this way, I think it's actually pretty similar to company structures, where you don't start a company with 200 employees. You start a company with a couple of co-founders. But as a project matures and gets bigger, I see a liberal contribution model is helping with the growth side of things. So the idea is at some point, you should be able to get big enough, your community gets big enough that you can decentralize your authority. Just an idea of how a project trajectory might look like today, or how I envision this working all together. You have sort of this incubation phase early on where one person has an idea, works really hard on it for a certain period of time, and then as they grow and get really popular, it might turn into sort of this more liberal contribution model. But again, the goal is to grow as much as possible that that authority is no longer centralized on one person. And there's probably something in the middle there where it's going from one person to 5 people to more decentralized. And just as examples of this working in action, Rust, Django, Node are all examples of big projects that did start with a BDFL, and then they transitioned out once the community got big enough. So Jacob Kaplan-Moss, who was one of the BDFLs of Django, when they decided to step down, it was almost like an afterthought. He stepped down because he realized it just wasn't really needed anymore. Whenever decisions were being made by the Django community without him, he noticed that the community was healthier. He noticed that it revitalized development, that committers were more excited. And so he was sort of I'm still part of Django, but why do I need to be the person in charge? The community is so strong that I'm not needed anymore. And so that's sort of the ideal success model, right? And so on the flip side, do BDFLs work as a long-term strategy? Could you have a BDFL project forever? My answer to that is sort of yes, but with some caveats. So Clojure is an example of a modern project that uses a BDFL model, and as far as I can tell, has no plans to change that. So their BDFL is Rich Hickey, and Rich makes most of the commits to the project. And so if you remember what the Rust contribution graph looked like, with Clojure, you literally have one person who's making basically everything, and then a little bit sort of trickling down. The reason why this works, and as far as I can tell it does work, is because Clojure is being sustainably supported by a company called Cognitect. So Rich's company was called Metadata, and it merged with a company called Relevance. Relevance had a very deep and vested interest in supporting Clojure, so they merged and they created this company called Cognitect. And Rich works there. Everyone is perfectly happy with the situation, and Cognitect for the foreseeable future is able to continue supporting Clojure. They see it sort of as Clojure is a project that is developed by Cognitect and then shared out with the community, which is really different from a community-built project. So I think that works. It seems to work for Clojure. I think that the BDFL as a long-term strategy still requires getting lucky, right? So there was still Cognitect just kind of happened to help support the development of Clojure. And so it's really frustrating to be able to tell if a maintainer says sort of well, what is my long-term strategy here? Telling them oh, find a company to hire you and enable you to work on this forever is sort of this pipe dream or crossing your fingers. It's if someone said they wanted to get rich and telling them find someone rich and marry them versus just figuring out how to get rich yourself. So in the absence of having a benefactor like Cognitect is for Clojure, I see this model as a good way to figure out how to reduce maintainer burden. It's something to aspire towards. Finally, will it work for everyone? I think it's still too early to tell. These are all still crazy unproven theories. liberal contribution model is still really new. And not every project will fit into that model. So if you're a project with a fairly narrow scope, I can see it like BDFL could kind of work forever. Whereas if you're more of an ecosystem like Node or Rust, then it's a little bit different. It also just depends on the project's community and culture. So like Go being an example of a project that is effectively developed by employees at Google. And as far as I can tell from talking to people in Go, everyone is like kind of cool with that. There's no like deep hankering for people to like turn this into a more community-run project. And so, you know, if a project's community is happy with the way it's set up, then like there isn't necessarily a problem. But I see liberal contribution models, again, as just being this framework for what sustainability could look like. If we want to talk about what a success model for a project could look like, having sort of thinking about sort of like BDFL as an incubation type thing, and liberal contribution as a way to manage part-time contributions long-term, you sort of have this like framework of like how a project can grow. So that's it. I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but I'm here and on the internet, so.
You have questions if you want. You have a couple minutes.
Yeah. Sonia? Yeah, I think like Rust is actually probably an example of a project that does that pretty well, and Node. I guess like the caveat to all these is that there is always somebody who is sort of in charge. There is some sort of central team or decision-making body to help facilitate like all the like anarchy, mass chaos. And so, and I think like in this talk I was sort of conflating governance models with contribution models, and like they're not necessarily the same thing, but I think they're so closely related. So like governance being like who has final decision-making authority on things, like who is actually like making sure all the trains run on time. I think we're always going to need somebody to do that. But the idea of like having this longer tail of contributions of like engaging people as much as possible, I think there's sort of like this wide base that can be created that gets people excited about the project, grows your number of users, and then also grows the number of people that are contributing. But yeah, there'll always be sort of like that core. Back there. That's a good question. I have no idea how it affects closure specifically. I think people, my guess would be that people are more comfortable with it now than they were then. But I haven't really looked into like how that affects like closure specifically. I'd be really curious to know actually. Yeah. I've definitely heard like conflict from companies that like really want to be involved or make contributions to projects and they feel like they're not able to. And I imagine that's a lot harder in a BDFL project. As far as I can tell, Linux is still BDFL, but they also have the Linux Foundation, which basically helps support its development. Lots of companies paying into the foundation, and then Linus himself is employed as a fellow of the Linux Foundation. He doesn't want to run the foundation, so they're a very, I think of them as like very much an outlier type project. Just the size and scope of the Linux Foundation and the project is pretty unusual. Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you again.